1,700 years ago, something momentous happened in the history of the Christian Church. The emperor of the Roman Empire, which had hitherto persecuted the Church, called a council with representatives of the Church throughout the whole empire and even beyond. And the decisions of that council, which impacted and expanded the horizons of Scripture, were very important even to this day. They play a crucial role in the way that Christians from various traditions and denominations formulate their faith, understand who God is, and talk about the Trinity and the person of Jesus. And with the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicea, we thought it would be nice if we do a series of podcasts celebrating and exploring the heritage of that council for us today. Welcome to Horizons of Scripture, a biblical studies podcast with me, Charlie Hadjiev. It is a great privilege for us today to have Bishop Mary, Bishop of Llandaff, and to talk about the Council of Nicea and to talk about the relevance it has for the Church today, for believers, and for all kinds of questions that we struggle with. So thank you very much, Bishop Mary, for agreeing to be on the podcast. Or you said I should call you Mary.
Please,
yes.
please.
That's fine. And we are here, I want to say we're in the Bishop's Palace, but I understand we're not really in the Bishop's Palace, are we?
We're just next door, the Bishop's Palace, a grand house, which thankfully I don't get to live in. We can see out of the window here. So we're in a more modern house in the grounds of what used to be the Bishop's Palace.
Called Llysesgop.
That's right, yeah, which literally means the court of the bishop, but it's actually a house attached to an office.
Very good. And you're Bishop of Llandaff, which for our listeners from outside of Wales, we need to point out you're actually based in Cardiff.
That's right. The diocese extends, so it's a large portion of South East Wales. So we go right up to Merthyr Tydfil, we go across to Port Talbot, and we include some of the Vale of Neath. So it's the most populated diocese in Wales, but it's a beautiful part of South East Wales.
And how long have you been a bishop here?
So here just for about 18 months, so I'm a very new bishop, still very much learning the trade.
But you have a long history with the Church in Wales.
Yeah, I was ordained here in 1993, so a little over 30 years ago. So I've had more than 30 years of learning about Wales and learning and rejoicing as being part of the Church in Wales.
And so I guess that will probably make you one of the first women to be ordained in the Church.
Yes, it was. I joined, there had been women as deacons, faith and deaconesses before that within the Church for many years. But I joined a cohort of women who were hoping that the Church in Wales would one day allow them to be priests. But there was certainly no promise of that 30 years ago. So it's been an extraordinary journey.
Guess you never imagined you'd become one day a bishop.
No, if you had asked me 30 years ago, I would have said, probably not in my lifetime, but maybe in my daughter's lifetime, the Church will allow women to be bishops. So to me, that's a source of great hope that the Church, that sometimes it seems very slow to adapt, actually has made a very quick change in terms of the life of the Church.
So how has it been? How has your experience been as, throughout, observing, I guess, all that change over a period of 30 years?
It's a tremendous learning journey. The whole process, you never become a Christian, do you? You're always becoming a Christian. And the whole process of learning about ministry is exactly the same. For me, it's full of surprises, full of new things, and continuous learning. Sometimes it's difficult. It's very difficult when you find yourself at the centre of the disagreement. And when you're a woman in a church that is having issues and accepting the ministry of women, it's really hard to see yourself as any way neutral or to hide from a disagreement when you feel you're part of the focus of it. But it also puts you in a very godly place. And so it has been an extraordinary learning journey, and I'm grateful for every bit of it.
Mm. You also run, I understand?
I run badly. I run more for my mental and emotional health, and just to get some exercise. Life is, as for many people, is busy and full, and it would be very easy not to do any exercise.
Mm.
But we're so blessed here in Wales to be in a beautiful place where going outside is often a real joy. And so, to try and keep myself healthy and accountable, I try and do a bit of running.
I think you're a bit modest, because I understand you did half a marathon, which is quite impressive.
Thank you. I did it slowly, and I had a lot of help and a lot of support. But I was quite proud that I managed to do it, and I've signed up to do it next year.
Wow. It's half a marathon more than I can manage, I can tell you.
You haven't seen how slowly I run.
So we'll talk about the Council of Nicea and the Nicene Creed. And when you read the creed, I know sometimes we use it in liturgy and we study it, maybe even in our private devotions. It is full of quite a lot of heavy theological language. There is this idea that the Son and the Father are of the same essence or substance, homoousios, and so on. So it seems a little bit exotic. Great hobby horse for maybe theologians, but do you think it has any relevance to ordinary believers, to clergy in their ministry? Does it matter? Why do we need to think about those sort of things 1,700 years later?
It's such a good question. And there are so many complicated answers, and I might give different answers on different days. So there are times in church, in liturgy, when reciting the creed as part of worship can seem boring, it can seem irrelevant, particularly if there are lots of people who are new to church, and if we're just reciting the creed without any explanation, which we do quite a lot. I can sometimes find myself wondering, what are we doing to people? But then there are other times when I'm really grateful that we've got the creed, when our religion is not just a free-for-all, and in a society where so much doesn't seem to have boundaries. Sometimes I think, well, perhaps actually there is a comfort that we've got this touchstone of what Christians do believe. And when I've got my historical head on, it reminds me of our connection, that as Christians, we're not just the people of God worshipping now. We're connected to a body of faith that goes back over generations, back to the very beginning of our faith. And the creed is part of our inheritance. And when I think of the churches around us, the other expressions of Christianity, part of me knows the creed helps us to be a family. It's a document where we can gather round and find our connection, find the things that hold us together, and maybe explore some of the boundaries, because it sets a kind of map of family connections and what seems beyond the family, what seems challenging. So it is a rich source of connection, and it also contains some kind of difficulties. One of the things I've been reflecting on is the creed and language. So I grew up within the Anglican Church. So there was a time in my life when I could just have recited the Nicene Creed without any books. But because we, from time to time, modernise our language, and because I've moved to Wales and I'm learning the Welsh language, and so for a while I was saying the creed in the traditional language in English, and I learnt it in the traditional language in Welsh. Then we had liturgical revision, and we had slightly different versions in English and slightly different versions in Welsh. I probably couldn't just recite the creed now.
There are too many creeds now, too many versions of it.
Yeah, which is good, because our faith, our learning is always growing. And maybe creeds shouldn't just be about things that we recite by rote, but we have to attend to that learning. And when we don't attend to it, all kinds of bizarre things happen. That there's that funny story, isn't there, about a child who learns the Apostles' Creed just by hearing it, and talks about Jesus suffering under a bunch of spiders because that's what they've heard. They haven't heard Jesus suffering under Pontius Pilate.
Oh gosh.
And it reminds me that unless we attend, unless we make space for people to ask questions and to talk about what they're hearing, and maybe sometimes to ask challenging questions. Why do we talk about Jesus being the same substance as the Father? What's that about? Is it mental gymnastics? Is it important? So we have to have space for people to explore and to learn properly. And I guess at different times, the creed throws up different questions. So the arguments about the substance of Christ and the nature of Christ, which is really why the Nicene Creed came into being, because of an argument that had grown up at a specific time. Maybe some of that seems like mental gymnastics to congregations now. But there are other bits of the Creed that can seem really important and really relevant to our time. So one of the things I've been really grateful about with the Creed just recently is what the Creed says about baptism. The Nicene Creed says we acknowledge one baptism.
Okay, which wasn't an issue that was debated at the time. It's just
but now in
it has
an
become
age,
quite important. Yeah.
Well, it has in an age where our culture is so individual and there's so much focus on individual experience. So it is quite an issue in the church at the moment of people coming maybe back to faith and saying, well, I know I was baptized as a baby, but it didn't mean anything to me and I want to have a meaningful experience. And people saying, can I be baptized again?
Mm.
It's really helpful to be able to point to the creed and to open up that discussion of faith, which allows us to explore. It's really important what your baptism means to you, but it's also important what your baptism says about God.
Yeah.
And the creed helps remind us the baptism points back to the God whose actions are irrevocable. You know, God forgives us.
Mm.
God doesn't make mistakes in forgiveness. And God doesn't need the action to happen again.
Yeah, it's a classic dilemma of our individualistic culture, what it means to me and how do I experience it. Yes. And it's a good reminder to think a bit more broadly. You've touched on a number of very, very important questions. Question of relationship to other Christian communities and traditions, the question about the living tradition, which we definitely need to talk more about. And also I was fascinated by this question of language as well, because the Nicene Creed is all about language. All the debates, as you say, were around this word homoousios, the same substance as the Father. And even in the Council of Nicea, there were many languages at play. So they were talking in Greek. The emperor, I think, initially addressed them in Latin. But there were also people who didn't even speak Greek, as far as I understand. There were Coptic bishops and others who had very little Greek. So I think it's a good reminder for us to consider the fact that language is so important, especially here in Wales, where you have the English and Welsh language interacting with each other in different ways, and us trying to find ways to express our faith in a genuine way.
And it all helps us to remember that our faith is so much bigger than we sometimes think. And it is so tempting to think that Jesus spoke the language that we speak, and of course he didn't.
No, that's right. Yeah.
And learning new languages opens us up to new ideas, to the possibility that our containers for ideas, our language, might be enriched by being expanded.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because we don't often realize that languages don't have exactly the same words and concepts and ways of speaking about things. So I have often found that if you read, let's say, a biblical passage in a different language, it sometimes gives you a completely different perspective of what it means. And so it would be, I mean, translating the Nicene Creed into English or Bulgarian or Welsh is in and of itself a challenge, isn't it? With all those philosophical concepts that were in the background.
It is, and it was one of the things I was really impatient about as a teenager, because of course, growing up in the church, the language of the Nicene Creed was very male, and for a young woman in the church, there were frequent references to man as an inclusive word for humanity,
Yes.
and language can change so quickly that sometimes the language of worship is a bit slow to
Remains, yeah.
catch up.
I know. I remember when I was learning English, I was quite fascinated that the word for man means human beings as well, because in Bulgarian we have a word човек, which means a human, and then we have man and woman, and we never use the word man to speak of all humans. So even that jump for me from Bulgarian to English was quite strange at the time, but I can appreciate how it comes with connotations if you are listening to it as a woman, I guess. Shall we talk about this question of tradition? That it's really fascinating one that you raised. The Nicene Creed connects us to tradition, and it is part of our tradition. So tradition is very important on one hand. On the other hand, it has a bad name sometimes in our world today. To be traditional can sometimes mean to be very stale or boring. So, I mean, how do you think about tradition, both from a Christian, well, I think primarily from a Christian point of view in theology and worship?
It's one of the words that I want to re-inhabit, because tradition is so important. But I think sometimes in church we're guilty of getting the idea of tradition wrong. We can think of tradition as being only lodged in the past, and we can think of it as being so fixed and so unchanging that I think that is an unhelpful and even unholy way to think of tradition. Our tradition has to be spirit-filled. It has to be the living, breathing inheritance of faith. It's when I think of what I want to hand on to my children, and hopefully to their children, to the next generation, I want to hand on something that will be life-giving. And in order for it to be life-giving, it has to be something that's alive. I think we see this when we go and visit different churches. We can go and visit churches that are stuck in the past in a way that is clearly dying. And you see this where you go somewhere and people have almost stopped caring. So where the decoration of the church is in a really poor state, and the linen is in a poor state, and people are doing the rituals, but they seem to have forgotten to inhabit them in a way that shows they're important. And where that's happening, it's hard to see where there's life. It's hard to see why anybody else would be drawn in. You can have almost exactly the same worship, but where the tradition is alive, and you can see it's alive by the way people relate to it. They relate to it as something that's important. So I want to re-inhabit, I want to name myself as a traditionalist, even if I seem different to some, because I want to show real respect for the gifts of faith that have been life-giving in the past and that continue to give life to the people of God now. So I think we do a disservice to tradition when we make it something that could never change, that could never have a heartbeat. So yeah, I think we have work to do to understand what tradition is and to respect it in the way that it deserves.
Yeah, this is so interesting because you're right. For tradition to really fulfill any meaningful purpose, it has to be living, it has to be relevant, it has to somehow connect to reality. I guess there is a tension here, and that's an ongoing discussion in Christian communities throughout the world, because the more tradition is living, the more there is the danger of it becoming something completely different. So changing its profile and really transforming into something that is utterly unrecognizable. So with the Nicene Creed, we have a fixed text. If we change that, it will no longer be the Nicene Creed. So, I mean, how do you negotiate this tension between tradition being something fixed on one hand, but on the other hand, having to be something that's living and growing organically, if you like?
I guess we're helped, and language can help us here, because you have tradition on one hand, don't you? And then you have those who are radical on the other side. And radical is also an interesting word, because I think it relates to something that is rooted. So radical can mean something new, but it also has roots in the past. So I think language helps us to see how things that appear to be in tension can actually speak to one another and engage. And there is a risk. There is a risk about anything that's alive. And that's what makes it exciting. That this is why I love theology, and it's why a world of ideas and thought and the interplay between revelation and tradition, to me, is exciting. There's a potential for something new, and it's a bit scary that we can't predict or control. But that's part of living in the world of faith, isn't it?
Mm. Yes, I mean, a small child is very different to a grown-up person, but they're still the same.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's scary, which is why sometimes people are afraid of that tension. I mean, there was a lot of debate around. There is usually always, I guess, there is debate and sometimes even acrimony, I guess, when you are trying to move forward and to change and challenge things with tradition.
But the Nicene Creed is a really good example, isn't it, of how people came together over an idea that seemed new and interesting. And it was an idea that came from a good place, wasn't it? That Arius, the kind of popular preacher who was wanting to explore who Jesus was, what Jesus's connection was to God, and wanting to work out the kind of philosophical connection. And there has always been, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, hasn't there, the tension between where you start, whether you start in heaven or whether you start on earth. And as human beings, there's an understandable bias of wanting to start with our experience. But faith is also wanting to speak about God. And it's where you begin your theology. And as a younger person, I always had so much sympathy with Arius, of his desire to start with humanity and to explore the humanity of Christ. And I guess, at Nicea, there was an opportunity for the whole body of faith, or for representatives of the body of faith, to come together and say, well, from my position, it looks like this. Oh, yeah, but have you thought about this? And to come to an agreement of where the church as a body would stand, and how to put something together that would be as inclusive as possible, but which define the limits of what the church could hold together.
There is an interesting dimension to that, because obviously Arius was a preacher in Alexandria, and he got into a debate with the bishop, Alexander of Alexandria. So it was a debate between a bishop and one of their priests. So I wonder how you think about that now as a bishop from?
Well, really interesting, because there's
And I
power
guess
dynamic.
you've changed your views because you weren't always a bishop, were you?
No, and at different times in your life, you see arguments from different perspectives, don't you? And the role I have now is focused upon the unity of the church. As a youngster, I was
You want to
passionate.
smash things up and shake
Yeah.
things up.
Well, and that is the job of essentially of the young, but not only of the young. It's really important that the church listens to all the voices, and we also have to be able to give an account for ourselves. So we do have to find a place of unity, and yet it's never easy. It's always an ongoing tension.
Yeah, and I suppose in our present culture, with all this talk about post-truth and conspiracy theories, and sometimes people being suspicious about messages that come from places of power, which sometimes is a healthy thing and sometimes can be quite destructive. It's quite difficult to find the right balance. It's not as easy as, say, the bishop is always right or the rebel is always right. There is always some sort of tension in the debate.
Well, that's one of the beautiful things about Nicea, and one of the things I've always appreciated about the Anglican Church is it is never one person who says. It's always a collection of voices, and I have always loved within Anglicanism this idea of being able to be an umbrella of faith, to be a church which holds together a diversity of views. I mean, of course, there are still limits, simply because we have to be able to describe who we are and we have to be accountable for that. But the diversity of Anglicanism and this desire to be the via media, to find a middle way, but which is also in touch with people who would be at the limits of that middle way, that has always offered something attractive and worth defending.
Yes, I agree. It is a tricky situation to manage, but a very important one. It raises the question, I guess, also about the relationship between unity and truth, because so the different parties that were debating areas and a lot of his supporters, because he had quite a huge following, and then Alexander and the other bishops who were on the other side, they were very passionate about these things. Because they were passionate about truth, they wanted to formulate a view of God and Christ and the Word and the Son of God that was reflective of tradition and a genuine expression of the Christian faith. So there was a lot of passion for truth. And of course, Constantine, who had just become the emperor of the whole empire, he has vanquished his enemies. He wants unity. So there is a lot of pressure from the political center on all these different parties to kind of sideline their differences and agree on something. There is a fascinating letter he writes before the Council of Nicea to Arius and Alexander. And he reprimands both of them. He says, these are insignificant matters. Just drop it, accept each other, and move on. Let's evangelize the empire. That's his passion. But of course, these guys don't want to do that because they are passionate about their own particular views. So I guess that tension is still with us even today. We want unity on one hand, but we are also passionate about the truth, and it's very hard to get the balance right. You always go into one direction or the other, don't you?
Oh, totally. I mean, you could say nothing has changed. If you look at the Anglican Church now and the diversity of views and the the arguments that continue. How can we be one church when we have very differing views on some issues? And how do we find our unity? And Anglicans have always been interesting on doctrine, haven't we? That there's the old saying, isn't it? If you ask 3 Anglicans for their view on any particular doctrine, you'll get 5 answers. That we live with a complexity, and we kind of invite diversity, but managing that and living with it in a godly way is always a challenge.
So, what are some of the challenges today that you see might in some way resemble those ancient debates?
Well, you can look on the micro level. So you could look at Llandaff diocese, which probably is one of the most liturgically diverse of the church in Wales. So we have Anglo-Catholics in the diocese who offer a worship that is very beautiful and very formal, and we have conservative evangelicals who offer a worship that is very informal and very free, and keeping a sense of family relationship where we're able to recognize the gifts in both rather than focusing on the differences, and where we can get to a situation where we speak well of one another rather than defensively is always the challenge. And you see exactly the same thing across the communion, and it comes to a focus on some issues such as attitudes to women in ministry or attitudes to the diversity of human sexuality. And the arguments can become very brittle and almost overtake every other strand of unity that we hold in common. And it seems crazy when there are other things that are really challenging humanity at the moment, like the ecological catastrophe that's afflicting the world. It seems crazy that the biggest voice of the church in the public sphere is not about that.
Yes. And there is unfortunately quite a lot of skepticism in some quarters about even the reality of that. Yeah.
But there are also places of enormous hope. So I had the privilege to attend the Anglican Science Commission, where we were addressed by Frances Collins, who is was head of the Human Genome Project, and by Jennifer Wiseman, a senior scientist at NASA who worked on the Hubble telescope, both Christians, addressing a group of worldwide bishops, engaging the world of serious science with the world of serious theology, and wanting to have a discussion, recognising the importance of bridging worlds of knowledge and of us not atomising in the way that sometimes it feels the world wants us to do. Sometimes it can feel as if the world of theology has lost some of its engagement with the wider world of thinking and particularly with kind of critical thinking. But it was tremendously encouraging to see the worldwide Anglican Church actively involved in a debate where we were being welcomed by others who represent a world that sometimes is seen diametrically at odds.
Yes, I think, for me, one of the biggest lessons relating to all this is the importance of ambiguity and the fact that our discomfort sometimes with complexity and our inability to deal with nuance, which psychologically is understandable because we all want to feel certain somehow. We want to be safe. We want things to be clear. But when we bring this over to our understanding of who God is and who we are in this world, it can be quite dangerous because things are not always as clear cut. And it's interesting that Nicea came out with a very defined document, but there's still a lot of debates, and even how you understand these words, different people had different takes on it. So it didn't really end the ambiguity. We still live with it today. And whether it's sexuality or climate or all these other issues, we have somehow to cope with all that.
It was brilliant. They came out with a document. That's always the challenge of any international conference,
the document.
But then the document is meaningless unless people can live into it. So the unity, the test of the creeds really is how far the church or the continuing community can continue to live into the hopes of the document. And it's extraordinary that the Nicene Creed has lasted until now, and it's extraordinary that the church has managed still to gather around it. And I guess it's a continuing challenge for us how far we're still able to do that. There are the kind of two purposes, aren't there, of the church that sometimes famously been described, hasn't it? That the object of the community of faith is to comfort the afflicted, but also to challenge the comfortable. Mm. And sometimes we're really good at the comforting the afflicted, of looking out for those who feel hurt. But the challenging the comfortable bit, the prophetic ministry of the church, that takes us to the edges. That's the exciting bit, isn't it? Of how we continue to engage with things that sometimes feel a bit provocative, and how we prevent church from being a place of privilege and comfort for us, and how we're involved with addressing the injustices and the hurts of the world. That's our real challenge.
Yes. It's very easy, especially when you become comfortable yourself. It's very difficult to challenge yourself.
It's a real challenge for women in ministry, but particularly for those who worked hard for their place. But it will be a complete disaster for the church if women gain a place in ministry but don't bring anything of themselves, don't bring anything new. If we just conform to what was, then what's the point of ordaining women? It has to be about using the gifts that God's given us. It has to be part of growing the community of faith.
Yes, the whole point of diversity is really to make things richer and more interesting and more true. There's maybe one other question that we can touch briefly before we finish our conversation. We've alluded to that several times. It's the role of the emperor at the council, which kind of raises the question about the relationship of the church to society at large, but more importantly to political power. And the dynamics in those days were different because you had an emperor who ruled autocratically. We live in democratic societies, at least we kid ourselves that we do, maybe, or we aspire to live within a democratic system. So the dynamics are very different. And of course, the Church in Wales is in a slightly different position than the Church of England because it's disestablished. But what are your thoughts on the way that we as a church, you as bishops, relate to political power, to the Welsh government, to Westminster, to all those structures?
Yeah, it's so interesting. And we have to be real and open about power. And sometimes maybe we kid ourselves a little bit. Sometimes bishops feeling, oh, well, we're not very powerful, we can't make a difference. Yet we still wear imperial purple. And we, all of us, have power, whether we recognise it or not. And there can't be any separation between the political life and the religious life. The prophets show us this in large letters, that faith has to be involved in every part of life. I think we're very blessed in Wales that there is still tremendous respect for the voice of the church. I feel that our politicians still care about faith communities and still care about consulting and about forging relationships. We're having to be more grown up, and that's a good thing. And the church is having to recognise we are a faith voice, not the only faith voice. But that's helpful. It means we can't be complacent. And it means we need to think carefully about how we engage. But I think we have good relationships with our politicians. Our Archbishop has done a fantastic job about keeping the church's voice in the public square. So, for example, we've recently had a big summit on rivers and pollution, to which all kinds of stakeholders in our waterways, including politicians, scientists, local government representatives, and people involved in the water companies, came together to talk about the problems, but more importantly, to talk about our shared responsibility to do something about it. So I think we have all kinds of opportunities to be hugely engaged. We would be massively irresponsible if we weren't engaged. And it feels like Wales is a really good place to be doing that.
Yes, it's a challenge also, because it's not the opportunity, but when you are engaged, how you are contributing. So that question of climate change is obviously an important one. There is the bill of assisted dying that we discussed earlier on as well, and I mean, how do you contribute to that debate is quite challenging, isn't it?
It is, and how we listen in that debate. I wonder if in previous generations it's been tempting for church leaders simply to give the church's view, but we're in a time now where it's increasingly obvious we need to listen because people care and they have something to contribute. And unless we hear what people's questions actually are, they're not going to listen to us trying to offer answers. And so on assisted dying in particular, listening to people's experience, and the way we engage in the debate will make such a difference as to whether we're heard or not. Really keenly aware of that, and really keenly aware of the need so often in all of these debates actually to slow things down. And rather than diving in with answers and responses, to spend more time listening to God and also listening to God's voice through the people who are engaged from different perspectives.
Yeah, connecting the theology to the experience of people and to reality is so important. It's so easy to talk about it in abstract terms rather than hear how that impacts the experience of people. Well, it has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. I think we've explored a lot of different avenues and ways in which this seemingly quite obscure event, for some people at least, has ongoing significance and contemporary relevance. So thank you very much for giving your time to this. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. The privilege is mine.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and watch out for future episodes.
If you're interested in theology, why not visit the St. Padarn's Institute website and check out our programs.